Imagine, for a moment, the year is 1944. The skies over Germany are a killing field. Two men, separated by nationality, ideology, and the thin metal shell of their fighter planes, are hunting each other at 400 miles per hour. One is an American farm boy from California, flying a silver P-51 Mustang. The other is a battle-hardened German ace with over 200 kills to his name, piloting a Messerschmitt Bf-109. If they meet, one of them will almost certainly die. This was the brutal mathematics of aerial combat in World War II. No prisoners, no mercy, just the stark binary of survival. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Decades later, these same two men would sit together in a small house during an air show in Wisconsin, sharing a bottle of German liqueur every night for a week, solving, as one of them later put it, all the world's problems. They would write forewords for each other's memoirs. They would call each other brothers. And when one died, the other would mourn him not as a former enemy, but as one of the closest friends he'd ever known. This is not a fairy tale. This is the true story of Bud Anderson and Günther Rall, two of the most lethal fighter pilots who ever lived, and two men whose friendship would prove that even the deepest wounds of war can eventually heal. To understand the depth of their later bond, you must first understand who these men were when they were trying to kill each other. Clarence Emil Bud Anderson was born in 1922 in Oakland, California. He wasn't supposed to be a warrior. He was a quiet farm kid who loved airplanes the way other boys loved baseball. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Bud was just 19 years old. By 1943, he was in England, assigned to the 357th Fighter Group, flying escort missions for bomber formations deep into Nazi Germany. Anderson's combat record speaks for itself. He flew 116 combat missions between 1943 and 1945, completing 2 full combat tours. He shot down 16.25 enemy aircraft, the quarter credit coming from a shared kill, making him what the Air Force called a triple ace, a pilot with 15 or more aerial victories. But numbers don't capture the reality. Every one of those 16 kills represented a moment when Anderson had to be faster, smarter, and luckier than another trained pilot who was desperately trying to kill him first. He flew through flak so thick it looked like black cotton. He watched friends spiral down in flames, and he kept flying. His aircraft of choice was the P-51 Mustang, arguably the finest fighter plane of the war. Anderson named his plane Old Crow after his favorite bourbon whiskey, a Kentucky brand he couldn't actually drink while stationed in England, but whose label reminded him of home. That Mustang became an extension of his body. He knew every rivet, every quirk of its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, every tiny advantage he could squeeze from its aerodynamics in a dogfight. And Anderson had one other crucial quality. He was best friends with Chuck Yeager, another legendary pilot. The two Californians flew together, drank together, and learned the deadly geometry of air combat together. But Anderson, for all his lethality in combat, was not a killer by nature. He was doing a job. A terrible, necessary job, but still just a job. He didn't hate the Germans flying against him. He didn't know them. They were just silhouettes in the sky, threats to be neutralized so he and his bomber crews could go home. This distinction between killing and hating would matter enormously later. Now consider Günther Rall. Born in 1918 in Gaggenau, Germany, Rall was 4 years older than Anderson and entered the war far earlier. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1938, before the war even began. By the time Anderson was flying his first combat mission, Rall was already a seasoned veteran with dozens of kills. And by the war's end, Rall had become something almost superhuman in the annals of aerial combat, the third highest scoring fighter ace in history. The numbers are staggering. Rall flew 621 combat missions, more than 5 times as many as Anderson. He shot down 275 enemy aircraft. To put that in perspective, that's 17 times more kills than Anderson, and more than the combined total of the top 5 American aces of the entire war. Rall didn't fight on one front, he fought on 3. He flew in the Battle of France, the Battle of Britain, and then was transferred to the Eastern Front, where the fighting was so brutal and constant that pilots sometimes flew 4 or 5 missions a day. The vast majority of his kills, 272 of them, came against Soviet pilots over Russia and Ukraine. But this success came at a horrific cost. Rall was shot down 8 times. 8 times he had to bail out or crash land, survive the impact, and somehow make it back to his own lines. He was wounded 3 times. In 1941, his back was broken in 3 places during a crash landing. Doctors told him he'd never fly again. He spent months in agonizing recovery, his spine held together with metal rods. He lost his left thumb to combat injuries, and yet, impossibly, he returned to combat. The pain never fully left him. He would live with chronic back pain for the rest of his life. But Rall kept flying because, in his own words, his friends were still fighting, and he couldn't abandon them. By 1944, Rall had been promoted to command JG 300, a fighter wing tasked with defending Germany itself against the waves of American bombers and their Mustang escorts that were systematically destroying German industry. This is when the paths of Rall and Anderson truly converged, though they likely never knew it at the time. Somewhere over Germany, in the chaos of contrails and tracer fire and screaming engines, these 2 men may have actually fought each other. They flew in the same airspace, in the same battles, hunting the same skies. The thought would haunt both of them later. In another universe, one of them would have killed the other, and we wouldn't be telling this story. When the war ended in May 1945, both men survived, a statistical miracle in itself. For fighter pilots on both sides, the odds of surviving the entire war were appallingly low. Anderson returned to California, married his sweetheart Eleanor, and continued his Air Force career as a test pilot. He flew the cutting edge of American aviation, jets, experimental aircraft, pushing the boundaries of speed and altitude. He didn't think much about the Germans he'd fought. The war was over. He'd done his duty. Time to move on. Rall's post-war experience was far more complicated. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided. The Luftwaffe he'd served no longer existed. He was 37 years old with no country, no military, and a broken body held together by sheer willpower. For several years, he worked in various civilian jobs, trying to rebuild a life in the ruins. But then, in the 1950s, something unexpected happened. West Germany was rearmed as part of NATO. The new Bundesluftwaffe, the German Air Force, needed experienced officers. And despite everything, despite the crimes of the Nazi regime and the controversy of German rearmament, Günther Rall was invited to help build this new force. He accepted. Rall became one of the founding generals of the modern German Air Force, working closely with NATO and inevitably with American officers. He flew American F-86 Sabres and F-104 starfighters. He trained a new generation of German pilots, this time to defend democracy against the Soviet Union rather than to serve a totalitarian dictatorship. It was during this period that Rall first began to encounter former Allied pilots in professional settings. The meetings were awkward, formal, stiff. These men had been trying to kill each other just years before. Now they were supposed to be allies. Anderson, meanwhile, had no interest in meeting his former enemies. He'd moved on. When he finally retired from active duty and transitioned to civilian life, he assumed that chapter of his life was closed. But then he started receiving invitations to air shows, to symposiums, to conferences where military historians and aviation enthusiasts gathered to discuss the war. And at these events, inevitably, there were German pilots. Old men now, gray-haired and walking with canes, wearing the same kind of leather bomber jackets and unit patches that Anderson wore. Men who had flown Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, men who had fought on the other side. Anderson was reluctant at first. What would they even talk about? How do you shake hands with someone who might have killed your friends? But curiosity eventually won out. During his active duty years, while still serving as a test pilot, Anderson met his first German pilot at a professional function. The encounter was brief, polite, unremarkable, but something shifted in Anderson's mind. This wasn't a monster. This was just another pilot, another man who'd been young once, scared, doing what he was told. After retirement, Anderson began attending more of these gatherings. in the United States, at symposiums organized by aviation historical societies, and then, more significantly, in Germany itself, at reunions of the Gemeinschaft der Jagdflieger, the Association of Fighter Pilots. These were remarkable events. Old Luftwaffe aces, men with hundreds of kills between them, gathering to remember fallen comrades and share stories from a war that felt increasingly distant. And increasingly, Allied pilots were being invited as honored guests. It was at one of these events that Bud Anderson first met Günther Rall. The details of their first meeting are lost to time. Neither man recorded the exact date or location in their published memoirs. But what we do know is how quickly and deeply the two men connected. There was an immediate recognition between them, a sense of kinship that transcended nationality or language or the war that had defined both their lives. They were the same species, fighter pilots. And fighter pilots, regardless of what flag they flew under, shared something that no one else could truly understand. They understood what it meant to fly alone into hostile sky, with nothing but your own skill and a few thousand pounds of metal between you and oblivion. They understood the peculiar mixture of terror and exhilaration that came with combat, the way time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. They understood what it was like to watch friends die, not abstractly, not in distant reports, but right there in formation, seeing the flash of fire, the spiral of smoke, the empty space where a wingman used to be. They understood survivor's guilt. They understood the nightmares. They understood the strange cognitive dissonance of being celebrated as heroes when they felt, deep down, like they'd just been lucky. And crucially, both men had evolved beyond the war. Rall, in particular, had undergone a profound transformation. He was clear in every interview and memoir that he had served Germany, not the Nazi Party. He hadn't joined the Luftwaffe because he believed in Hitler's ideology. He'd joined because he loved flying and wanted to serve his country. But as the war progressed, as he saw the devastation wrought on both sides, as the truth about Nazi atrocities became undeniable, Rall's perspective shifted. By the war's end, he knew Germany had been on the wrong side. He knew the regime he'd defended had committed unspeakable crimes. There's a telling detail about Rall's character that Anderson would later learn. During the war, Rall's wife, Hertha, had secretly helped Jewish families escape Nazi persecution. She risked her life to do it. The Gestapo eventually discovered what she was doing, and Hertha was arrested and interrogated. Under normal circumstances, this would have meant a death sentence, but Günther Rall was a national hero, one of Germany's most decorated pilots, and the regime couldn't afford the scandal of executing a war hero's wife. The matter was quietly dropped. Hertha survived. After the war, several of the families she'd helped escape tracked her down to thank her. Rall never sought credit for this. It was his wife's courage, not his. But it revealed something about the man's character, about the household he came from. When Anderson learned this, something clicked. This wasn't a Nazi. This was a decent man who'd been caught on the wrong side of history. The breakthrough in their relationship came through their memoirs. Rall had written an autobiography in German, documenting his experiences in the Luftwaffe. His editor suggested that for the English translation, they should include a foreword from a distinguished Allied pilot, someone who could speak to Rall's skill and character from the other side. Rall immediately thought of Anderson. Despite knowing him for a relatively short time, Rall felt a deep respect for the American ace. He reached out, and Anderson, somewhat to his own surprise, agreed. Writing that foreword forced Anderson to think deeply about Rall, about the war, about what it all meant. And then, in a gesture of reciprocity, when Anderson's own memoir was being prepared for publication, he asked Rall to write the foreword for his book. This exchange of forewords became a kind of mutual blessing, each man vouching for the character and skill of the other. But the real deepening of their friendship happened at Oshkosh. The Experimental Aircraft Association's annual fly-in at Oshkosh, Wisconsin, is the world's largest gathering of aviation enthusiasts. Every summer, Hundreds of thousands of people descend on this small Wisconsin town to see experimental aircraft, vintage warbirds, aerobatic displays, and, crucially, to meet aviation legends. For older pilots, particularly World War II veterans, Oshkosh became an annual pilgrimage. They'd sign autographs, give talks, pose for photos with their old aircraft. It was exhausting work for men in their 70s and 80s, but they kept coming back because it mattered. The young people who lined up to meet them, to hear their stories, to shake their hands, these were the keepers of memory. One year, the exact date is uncertain, but likely in the late 1990s or early 2000s, both Bud Anderson and Günther Rall were invited as featured guests. The organizers arranged for them to stay in the same house to save costs, and because they knew the two men were friends. What happened that week would become one of Anderson's most cherished memories. Every evening, after a full day of airshow appearances, photo sessions, and speaking engagements, the two old warriors would return to their shared house utterly exhausted. These were men in their late 70s or early 80s now, with bodies that ached from old injuries and decades of hard use. Most men their age would have collapsed into bed. But Rall and Anderson had a ritual. Günther would produce a bottle of German liqueur, a different one each night, Anderson recalled, always something from Rall's homeland. They'd pour generous glasses, settle into comfortable chairs, and talk. Not about flying necessarily, or even about the war. They'd talk about everything: politics, philosophy, their families, their regrets, their hopes for the world. They'd argue good-naturedly about historical controversies. They'd share jokes that only old pilots would understand. And they'd keep talking, keep drinking that German liqueur until the bottle was empty. Only then would they finally head to bed. Anderson described this in an interview years later with a kind of wonder in his voice. After a week of that kind of nonsense, he said, you really get to know a person. It was an understatement. Those nights, fueled by alcohol and exhaustion and the unique intimacy that comes from shared understanding, cemented a bond that went far beyond mere friendship. They became brothers in every sense that mattered. There's a photograph from one of these Oshkosh gatherings that captures something essential about their relationship. It shows Anderson and Rall sitting together in the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, the very type of aircraft Anderson had flown, and the very type that Rall had fought against. They're both grinning like children. Anderson has his arm around Rall's shoulder. There's no awkwardness, no residual tension, no ghost of enmity. Just two old pilots delighted to be near a beautiful airplane, enjoying each other's company. The photograph is remarkable because of what's absent, any trace of the war that had once defined them. To understand the depth of their friendship, you have to read what Günther Rall wrote in his foreword to Bud Anderson's memoir. These weren't throwaway words or perfunctory praise. This was Rall at the end of his life, trying to articulate something profound about war, reconciliation, and the strange bonds that can form between former enemies. Rall wrote, "We are fortunate that we did not meet Bud Anderson until after World War II. I don't remember exactly when, but this much is certain. If we had met earlier in the skies over Germany, the consequences would have been fatal for at least one of us." Let that sink in for a moment. Rall is acknowledging, plainly and without sentimentality, that he and Anderson were killers. That if they'd encountered each other during the war, one of them would have died. There's no romanticizing this. But then Rall continues, "That bloodletting has left its mark on us like nothing else. All the evils that a human being can experience, but also the most moving examples of courage, self-sacrifice, and comradeship, were compressed into those 5.5 years. What a blessing that we survivors could later extend our hands to shake and serve peace side by side." This is extraordinary writing from a man whose native language wasn't English. Rall is saying that the war, with all its horror, all its trauma, all its moral complexity, created a kind of shared knowledge among those who survived it, and that this knowledge, paradoxically, became the foundation for reconciliation. The men who understood war most deeply were also the men most capable of moving beyond it. He continues, Bud Anderson has it all: an excellent combat record, an impressive professional career, a wonderful family, a rich life. He is a shining example of what America calls the right stuff. He embodies the ideal of the fighter pilot, aggressive in combat, yet fair and chivalrous toward the enemy, a reliable comrade, a good friend. Coming from Rall, a man who flew 621 combat missions and shot down 275 aircraft, this praise carries enormous weight. Rall wasn't given to flattery. He'd flown with and against some of the most skilled pilots in history. For him to call Anderson a shining example and the ideal of the fighter pilot meant something. It meant that in Rall's professional judgment, formed over decades of combat and command, Anderson represented the best of what a warrior could be. But perhaps the most moving part of Rall's foreword is what comes at the very end. He writes about how blessed they both were to have survived, to have found each other in peace, to have had the opportunity to build a friendship across the chasm of war. There's a sense of gratitude in Rall's words, almost disbelief that this reconciliation was possible. He'd spent his life in combat, had seen thousands die, had himself been broken and rebuilt multiple times, and here, in his old age, he'd found genuine friendship with a man who'd been his enemy. The statistical improbability of it, that both survived, that both mellowed with age, that both chose reconciliation over bitterness, wasn't lost on him. Günther Rall died on October 4, 2009, in Bad Reichenhall, Germany. He was 91 years old. His death marked the end of an era. He was one of the last surviving great aces of World War II, and certainly one of the last who'd achieved such extraordinary success. News of his passing was reported around the world, not just in military publications but in major newspapers. The German government honored him with a state funeral. NATO officials attended, and from California, Bud Anderson mourned the loss of his friend. Anderson would live another 15 years after Rall's death, finally passing away on May 17, 2024, at the age of 102. He was America's last surviving triple ace. In those final years, Anderson often spoke about Gunther in interviews, always with warmth and respect. He never forgot those nights in Oshkosh, never forgot the German liqueur and the late-night conversations, and the sense of kinship he'd found with a man who in another life might have killed him. There's something profoundly hopeful about this story, but it's important not to oversimplify it or turn it into cheap sentiment. Anderson and Rall's friendship didn't erase the war. It didn't undo the deaths or the trauma or the moral weight of the choices both men made during the conflict. Rall fought for Nazi Germany. That's an uncomfortable fact that can't be glossed over. And while Rall himself wasn't a Nazi, wasn't motivated by ideology, didn't participate in war crimes, and his wife actively resisted the regime, he still flew combat missions that helped prolong a war started by one of history's most evil regimes. But what their friendship demonstrates is that human beings are capable of enormous moral complexity, that soldiers on opposite sides of a war can both be, in their own contexts, decent people caught in historical forces beyond their control. That fighting bravely doesn't automatically make you right, and that being on the losing side doesn't automatically make you evil. And most importantly, that reconciliation, real, deep, genuine reconciliation, is possible even after the most traumatic conflicts. Anderson and Rall weren't unique. Across the world, throughout the latter half of the 20th century, thousands of former enemies from World War II were quietly building similar bridges. The phenomenon was particularly common among pilots, but it extended to sailors, soldiers, even some POWs and their former captors. There are documented cases of Luftwaffe pilots visiting their British counterparts at RAF bases, attending each other's reunions, becoming pen pals in their old age. There's an organization called the Old Bold Pilots Association, a group that included American, British, German, and even some Soviet pilots who met regularly, sometimes weekly, for breakfast and conversation. These weren't formal reconciliation programs or government initiatives. These were just old warriors who'd found more in common with each other than with the civilians who'd never experienced combat. They spoke the same language, not English or German or Russian, but the language of altitude and airspeed, of engine failures and near misses, of friends lost and moments survived. The question is, why? Why were pilots, specifically, so capable of this kind of reconciliation? There are several theories. First, fighter pilots were, by necessity, elite individuals. Only the best made it through training, and only the very best survived extended combat. This created a kind of mutual respect. You knew that anyone who survived long enough to become an ace, regardless of nationality, had to be exceptionally skilled. There was professional admiration there, even across enemy lines. Second, aerial combat was, paradoxically, more clean than ground combat. A pilot shooting down another aircraft didn't have to see the face of the man he killed. He didn't have to bayonet anyone, didn't have to clear buildings or execute prisoners or deal with the visceral horror of close-quarters killing. This psychological distance may have made it easier to separate the professional act of combat from personal hatred. Third, and perhaps most importantly, fighter pilots were profoundly aware of their own mortality in a way that created unusual humility. Every pilot knew that skill alone wasn't enough. Luck played an enormous role. You could be the best pilot in the world and still get jumped by someone you never saw, or suffer a mechanical failure, or simply be in the wrong place at the wrong second. This awareness that survival was at least partially random created a kind of philosophical equanimity. The German you shot down today could just as easily have been you yesterday. This made it harder to sustain hatred. There's a final image worth contemplating. Imagine you could show the two younger versions of these men, Bud Anderson in 1944, 22 years old, flying escort missions over Germany, and Günther Rall, 26, defending his homeland from American bombers. Imagine you could show them a photograph from 50 years in the future. A photograph of two old men sitting together in Wisconsin, arms around each other, laughing. Would they have believed it? Probably not. In 1944, reconciliation with the enemy would have seemed not just unlikely but morally obscene. How could you befriend someone who was trying to kill you, who'd killed your friends, who represented everything you were fighting against? The war demanded absolute commitment, absolute clarity about who was friend and who was enemy. Nuance was a luxury they couldn't afford. But time changes everything. The young men who fought each other with such determination both survived to become old men who'd learned that hatred is exhausting, that ideology is ephemeral, and that the things they had in common, their love of flying, their respect for courage, their understanding of fear, mattered more than the things that had divided them. This isn't a story with a simple moral. It doesn't prove that all wars are pointless, or that all enemies can become friends, or that reconciliation is always possible or always desirable. Some evils are unforgivable. Some wounds don't heal. But what the friendship between Bud Anderson and Günther Rall demonstrates is that humans are capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously, that you can fight a necessary war with lethal effectiveness, and you can later extend friendship to those you fought against. That being a warrior doesn't mean being consumed by hatred, and that sometimes the greatest victory isn't on the battlefield. It's in the quiet moment when two old enemies share a drink and solve the world's problems together. When Bud Anderson finally died in 2024 at the age of 102, he was mourned not just as one of America's greatest fighter pilots, but as a bridge between eras, between nations, between past and present. He'd fought the war his country needed him to fight, and he'd lived long enough to see what came after: reconciliation, friendship, peace. He'd known Günther Rall not as an enemy or even as a former enemy, but simply as his friend, his brother. The man he'd been lucky not to meet in the skies over Germany and lucky to meet everywhere else. That, perhaps, is the real lesson of this story. Not that war is glorious or that enmity is easily overcome, but that humans, even humans trained to kill each other, even humans who've spent years trying to do exactly that, are capable of eventually choosing connection over division, understanding over hatred, and friendship over the weight of history. The war ended in 1945. But for Bud Anderson and Günther Rall, peace didn't truly begin until they found each other decades later, raised their glasses of German liqueur, and started talking. That's when the real victory happened. That's when they both finally came home.